I'm Mary Margaret Jones with Hargreaves Jones. We're really pleased to be here today. My mother grew up in Baltimore, so this feels like coming home a little bit. Baltimore has a rich history of relationship with its water, both historically and more recently as a leader nationally in reclaiming waterfront for public occupation. The Middle Branch, however, has a completely different potential, a completely different opportunity from the Inner Harbor to be a park that's more of the 21st century, a new type of park that is both, that balances ecology and culture, that creates a place of habitat for people and for the plants and animals we depend upon, and to take what has become rigid barriers to people and barriers to habitat, and to make those tidal zones of influx and places of rich biodiversity. That biodiversity is why Baltimore is here. And to make that legible, and to make that legible in a park system that we believe can be cohesive and coherent as a place, as we said this morning, if it's imaginable, it's doable. And we think this can be a cohesive system, a lot of diversity within that system, but identifiable as a place within Baltimore, the Strand. We also feel that we can represent the fact that Baltimore falls on the fault line of the hills and the coastal plain. That's a very rich moment. So you think about this project as representing the falls and the shallows, and taking advantage of where the water is deep and where the water is shallow, and taking advantage of that moment in an approach that Claire and Kurt will describe in more detail of subtraction and accretion, and through subtraction and accretion, setting a new landscape in motion. So we don't see ourselves as creating something right now that's one big grand vision. We came up with a plan that is incremental, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and that sets in place a new landscape that it will evolve over time. So with that, I'll turn to Claire is next. Yes.
Thank you. So thank you, Mary Margaret. I'm Claire Augrey from Unknown Studio. I'm here to represent some of the local team, which was supporting this project. We have a wonderful group, Davin from Living Design Lab, where are you? Thank you. Tool Design, Neighborhood Design Center, many others. And it was a really wonderful collaboration, really a two-way street in terms of listening and bouncing ideas off of each other. So in that already, it's been a very fruitful local and global insider-outsider look at Baltimore. I'm going to walk us a little bit through history. It's a very important place to start because there's some really bright spots of history here on the Middle Branch, and there's also some darker history, and I think it's important we acknowledge both. So we have this timeline. I know it's very tiny for those of you in the back, but I'll try and sort of walk through it illustratively. One of the things when we come to this project is to think about the biodiversity that Mary Margaret alluded to. Baltimore is here because the edge is bountiful for millennia. Algonquin, indigenous peoples were fishing, farming, cultivating, and living on this edge. And before we had Smiths, before we had Lord Baltimore, we had the Susquehanna, the Patapsco, the Potomac, the Chesapeake. These are the names of these rivers and of these waterways. So the Patapsco is our river here in Baltimore, and we really want to reclaim that name. So it was always a place of commerce, always a place of really active engagement. It wasn't a kind of passive admiration of landscape. It was a place of work, a place of commerce, a place of trade. And as Baltimore developed, it moved from a more sustenance economy, as Baltimore was developed, into a more maritime, commercial, and place of trade. As the city industrialized, the waterways were hardened, they were filled in, and Baltimore became really a nexus of commerce for the world, the junction for the world. So rail comes, the port comes, all of these things are very beneficial to our city. The result is bulkheads, hardened edges, a barrier between the ability to be at the upland and get into your water. The Middle Branch, for instance, is 50% the size of what it was pre-colonization. So that's a dramatic infill. We'll talk a little bit more about the subtractive strategy being a way to reverse that. So as time goes on, industrialization occurs, the Great Fire of 1904, the Middle Branch gets harder and harder in terms of its profile and its section. And there's some pretty dark moments as well. The Middle Branch becomes a dumping ground and a toxic a location for toxic and brownfield industries. It becomes a place for environmental injustice. The incinerator site that we know today was the site of the Black Sox baseball diamond. So these things need to be acknowledged, they need to be discussed. We have a sort of approach where we don't memorialize these things, but we transform them and we acknowledge them and we activate them with new culture and new life. So moving further into my childhood, in the early 80s, Donald Schaefer and Rouse had this vision for Harbor Place. This is probably one of Baltimore's proudest moments in terms of international cachet, transforming the way we think about waterfronts. So in typical Baltimoreese fashion, with great humor and whimsy, Schaefer jumps into the seal pool at the National Aquarium and welcomes everybody to Harbor Place. And this becomes the model for waterfront development nationwide. Meanwhile, back on the Middle Branch, we're still seeing a kind of severe lack of public space, severe lack of investment, further segregation of communities from one another and from the water. So this is sort of the story of the Middle Branch. It's very much the story of Baltimore. I think a big part of this project is acknowledging this and trying to reverse it and think back to the biodiversity that brought us here in the first place. The fact that this is a landscape of active cultivation, crabbing, fishing, love of the water, commerce on the water, engagement with the water. This is cross-cultural, cross-racial, multi-age. We want to create a really active, lively place. So in addition to the physical transformations, this is very much an economic project. So it's one where job training is taken very seriously. Commercial uses such as nurseries, composting operations, jobs training, restoration economy are integrated into the plan so that on day one, the entire community can catalyze around this project and make it very implementable and feasible over the next decades.
I'm Kurt Reeder, principal at Hargreaves Jones as well. Both Mary Margaret and Claire talked about the timeline that has the 6 falls that empty into the Middle Branch as discharging lots of sediment and a lot of water to create the terrain over a millennium of time. And then Claire talked about the centuries of occupation that have dramatically changed it, and really in the last 120 years, that shoreline has changed dramatically. Our proposal as part of this competition is to push back on that in a subtractive way and to remove some of that. And to do it not all at once, not in one fell swoop, but to do it over a 20-year phased strategy. So these diagrams here talk about programmatically what you could do next month, and then moving into the planning and design and building for the next 5 years, and then looking ahead to the 10 and next 20-year horizons for how each of these different projects all along the Middle Branch could be implemented in an incremental phase. Never linear. There's not a prescribed sequence for any of these, but they can come and go as opportunities for land acquisition and easement and funding become available. So that's key to us. I think a lot of this you'll have to get up much closer to take a deeper dive into it, but suffice to say the basis of the competition was continuity along the 11 miles. By our estimation, there's about 4.75 miles that are non-existing today. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to integrate those or how to fill in those kind of lost teeth or missing teeth to provide the continuity as a pink line all the way around and across the 2 bridges. The South Hanover Street Bridge here, we took the strategy of saying either it's replaced or it's rebuilt. That project's on its own timeline, but regardless of what happens, bike and pedestrian facilities that connect people from Port Covington across to the South Bank, Cherry Hill, those are pivotal. For the swing bridge at Spring Gardens, we also believe that that's a critical connection as pedestrian and bike only. This is quite similar. This is 1,500 linear feet here. We just opened one in Richmond that's 1,800 feet long. It's something that took us about 4 years to get accomplished, but it's made a dramatic impact to a smaller city in Richmond, and we think it'll have an outsized influence here in Baltimore. So with the remaining minutes, I guess I will go through and point to some of the big pieces. We made improvements in Brooklyn along the Masonville Cove that connected back to Brooklyn and on to Curtis Bay. We acknowledge that the Patapsco River Bridge will be road dieted and provided as a viewing platform and fishing off the Patapsco there. And then moving up to The Middle Branch Park itself, we're doing some reconfiguration of the terrain, the topography, the program, and the circulation patterns so that there are a whole series of different ways in which we can engage with the shoreline that's not really plausible today. Right now it's kind of rubble edge or treed. You can't really interface with the river and the waterfront. Our goal is to make that a much more sinuous experience so that you're on the land, you're over the water, you move back and forth for different programmatic reasons and different experiences and exposures. Then we are saying that the marina becomes a public marina in whatever fashion that transpires. And then moving into what we're referring to, the Smith Cove Falls at that juncture between Annapolis Road and Waterview Road. That becomes a wetland nursery, a nursery in general. It becomes an economic engine to engage individuals in Cherry Hill and a way to pivot that crucial joint before moving on up into the development parcels of Westport. And so where we have kind of wild and sinuous pathways on this shore, we become a little bit more urban, more rectified, and a thinner profile of cross-section. Westport Promenade before then moving on up closer to I-95. At this point, where we go back to sinuous pathways that have to kind of thread the needle to get through the infrastructure of the light rail, the I-95 bridge, before popping out at the incinerator site. We're assuming the incinerator goes away, the smokestack stays. We repurpose that as a composting site and as an environmental center, but also as a great promontory that looks over the revegetation of the already silting in Ridgely Cove area. And then for us, pivotal, a lot of these smaller connections become pivotal because they tie potentially by the Topgolf site into Stockholm Street at Sharp Street before revegetating in a very serious and heavy way the whole Spring Gardens BG&E frontage. We're not moving into that area. We're building out away from it to create a public corridor and also a massive collection of new forest along that whole stretch down to Swan Park. And then continuing that down to the West Covington Park, heavily vegetated, different experiences moving back and forth with wetland edges, before getting into the West Covington, Port Covington area where we thread the needle and again have that continuous thread all the way to the distillery and to Winans Cove.
Yeah, did you breathe? So in conclusion, this will not happen without everyone at the table. And I think as landscape architects, we like dealing with open-ended processes, and this will be an open-ended process. So public, community, private entities, city, state, federal government will all be a part of making this happen. And that's why we feel this is a process of immediate things we can do to unlock potential now, and then planning for steps in the future that will continue this process in an open-ended way. We set a strong landscape framework within which development trends can evolve, because they will. So the value here is on the landscape framework that we will commit, create for existing communities and for the diversity of communities yet to come.